All right, everybody. Well, thank you very much again for joining us. Now our third panel, a title coined by the panel's author, I believe, Jennifer New, Civil Servant Disobedience. Let me introduce the moderator. It's Philip Wallach, Senior Fellow at the Governance Project at the R Street Institute, where he studies and writes on America's separation of powers, Congress, and the administrative state. We're now marking the 10th anniversary of the financial crisis, one of the best books you'll ever read on the financial crisis and its ramifications for administrative law and government is Philip's book. It's mentioned in his bio, To the Edge, Legality, Legitimacy, and the Responses to the 2008 Financial Crisis. It's a great book, and I highly recommend it. And we're so grateful that you could join us today. Philip.
Okay, thank you so much, Adam, for those kind words and for having me here. I will say a few words and then introduce the panelists. So, in preparation for this panel, yesterday I Googled the term the deep state. The deep state. I got 9 million results, the second of which is a book by the former chairman of the House Oversight Committee, Jason Chaffetz, which has the subtitle, How an Army of Bureaucrats Protected Barack Obama and is Working to Destroy the Trump Agenda. The deep state is almost a cliche at this point. It's a term that I don't think somebody who studied the bureaucracy, had ever really heard before 2016. It comes to us from the foreign policy world. It's was generally used in the context of developing countries to get at the reality that the generals and spies wielded the real power as opposed to the elected officials. But it's sort of apparently a very natural fit for our own administrative state. And the deep state versus Trump has become a kind of standby political trope. We don't really wonder anymore whether the deep state is influential. Of course it is. But now we're on to, should we be rooting for it or against it? And so that's being asked not only about the CIA or the NSA, but also about the EPA and the Department of Energy and others. So Professor No has written a very interesting paper kind of trying to sort out some of the normative issues around the deep state through her clever title of Civil Servant Disobedience. But it's more than just a clever title. She has a very compelling analogy to civil disobedience more generally. So I'll introduce her and then introduce the other panelists in turn. Jennifer No is professor of law at the University of Chicago Law School. Her research interests are administrative law, executive branch dynamics, regulatory policy, and the constitutional separation of powers. She has previously been a public law fellow at Chicago and a policy analyst at OIRA. Previously a graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School, a Marshall Scholar, a law clerk for Richard Posner and Stephen Breyer. It's a very distinguished record, and I turn it over to you, Jennifer.
Okay, great, thank you. So the idea that career civil servants don't march in lockstep with their political appointees is hardly news, right? So think Mark Felt, right, deep throat, and the idea of bureaucrats disagreeing, leaking, disagreeing with their political superiors. Think of immigration and customs enforcement agents, reports of resistance in the Obama administration to what they perceived as the illegal policies of the Obama administration on deferred action. What is potentially novel under the Trump administration, or so I want to argue and explore, is the extent to which that resistance is overt, public, and exerted by civil servants in their official capacity. Let's call this phenomena civil servant disobedience. So to preview, drawing indeed on the literature on civil disobedience by private citizens, I want to explore two questions. The first question is there indeed a set of social practices that can usefully be grouped under this heading, civil servant disobedience? And then second, when is this practice legitimate, if at all? And I ask that as a real question because lest I be understood to be advocating for bureaucratic resistance, to the contrary, I want to search for constraints. And the paper, as I've said to others, reflects my own internal monologue and going back and forth by saying it's never justified to saying, okay, well, maybe there are pockets where we can see some normative space for it. And then if civil disobedience is about voice, I'm also going to address perhaps the strongest objection to it, which is that of exit, that is of resigning. And then I'll just conclude by just taking a brief step back and assessing the broader implications of civil servant disobedience on the administrative state. Okay, so let me begin with a definition. So civil servant disobedience is a distinct species of resistance involving conscientious as opposed to, let's say, self-serving. In other words, I'm interested in career staff that genuinely, sincerely believe that they are confronted with illegal behavior rather than simply trying to resist the policy preferences of their political superiors. Civil servant disobedience is also public and open as opposed to covert and secret. And it also violates internal agency directives. That is to say, a civil servant is engaging in this social practice when they are violating an executive directive. And they do it in an attempt to bring about political reform. So let me just give you some examples that I want to suggest fall into this category. Okay, so first, in Chicago, right, we had EPA employees on their during the workday openly, publicly protesting Trump's nominee Scott Pruitt for the EPA, and many more generally have just remarked upon what the quote open rebellion within the EPA. Another example that I suggest might fall into this category, we had 19 special agents at the Immigration Customs Enforcement Office. They wrote a public letter to Kirsten Nelson, the Secretary of DHS, arguing that the Enforcement and Removal Operations Unit be spun off from the agency because Trump's immigration policies could be controversial and confusing. Okay. I want to distinguish civil servant disobedience from other forms of resistance, which I have nothing to say about normatively, because I'm really trying to cabin the unit of analysis or the topic here. Let me distinguish the phenomena from conscientious objection, which might be understood as non-public acts of withdrawing from what they perceive as legal policies to fulfill one's own sense of personal integrity rather than trying to bring about political reform. So think, for example, of the DOJ lawyer, career staff lawyer that withdraws from a case without more because they don't agree with it as a legal matter. That would be what I would call conscientious objection rather than civil servant disobedience. And I'm tracking the philosophical literature. I haven't made these categories up myself. David Posen and Jessica Bowman-Posen have also identified another species more generally of what they call uncivil obedience, by which they mean covert acts that don't violate any law or norms, but they work to, these individuals engaging in this practice just work to rule. That is to say, they will follow the directive, right? But they're doing it in a way that is trying to express dissent about the policy. So for example, take stories under the Reagan administration when you had USDA career staff saying, look, I'm gonna argue that ketchup is indeed a vegetable, but I'm not going to advocate vigorously for it. So they're working to rule. But that could be understood as a case of uncivil obedience. And then finally, perhaps there is another category in this taxonomy. I don't want to be too cute about it, but some combination of these elements. You might call it conscientious disobedience. But basically, this category is covert action that tries to engage in public protest. And this category might be useful for thinking about leaks, which are anonymous, right? But they are clearly often intended to bring out some political reform by releasing this public information. So on to the second question, having, I hope, convinced some of you that is worthwhile isolating this particular form of bureaucratic resistance. Under what conditions is this practice justified? So just as justificatory accounts of private civil disobedience, sometimes they argue that when there are defects in the democratic process, those defects can justify political disobedience. So this was often an argument made during the civil rights movement, right? That because the democratic process had defects, in terms of engagement with particular communities, African American communities primarily in the political process, that justified civil disobedience. So too, I want to argue that defects in the internal bureaucratic process may similarly justify civil servant disobedience. And in this sense, perhaps the practice is concerned with bureaucratic process perfection. Okay, what do I mean by that? Okay, I want to argue for something that I'm calling reciprocal hierarchy, by which I simply mean that hierarchies are not only top-down mechanisms in bureaucracies for imposing control, but it's also a mechanism to encourage bottom-up information flow from career staff to political appointees. I want to argue that when this ideal is violated, that is to say, when political appointees refuse to deliberate with civil servants under statutes that require information and expertise from civil servants, that perhaps there is normative space for civil servant disobedience. Again, if career staff are simply cut out of the process altogether, I'm not saying that political appointees should follow their recommendations, but when they are not even heard or consulted or listened to, deliberated with, perhaps there is a role for this practice. But this condition alone, I argue, is not sufficient in itself, for ultimately, I think the practice of civil servant disobedience, like private civil disobedience, exhibits this paradox where both practices are law-breaking, but they ultimately do so in the service of reaffirming the rule of law. Let me tell you a little bit more what I mean. The private civil disobedience literature imposes a number of conditions that I think are fruitful to import here. So for example, I think that civil servant disobedience should only be used as a measure of last resort. That is to say, when all the other channels of getting that information into the policy process are broken down or otherwise unavailable, I think only then could this practice be justified. So here I just want to observe, for example, that many people believe that the whistleblower process has many flaws. For example, there are the Merit Systems Protection Board has lacked a quorum for the longest period in its history, and that's relevant because, of course, many whistleblowers have a direct appeal and can directly go to the Merit Systems Protection Board, or otherwise the board will review Office of Special Counsel whistleblower complaints. Insofar as inspectors general are another office to which whistleblowers can go, there are vacancies in a number of key agencies like the Department of Homeland Security. So in addition to being a measure of last resort, I think the civil servant disobedience, the civil servants must be willing to exhibit willingness to accept the legal consequences of their actions. Okay, again, this is reaffirming the rule of law, okay, and making their actions, I think, much more credible when they are willing to accept a sanction that is imposed for this behavior. Let me just address two more conditions. I think that civil servant disobedience is only appropriate under statutes, again, as I've previewed, that require their information and their expertise. So for example, civil servant disobedience may be more justified under a statute that, say, requires the best available technology, where you might need the expertise and information of engineers and people who understand the technology in a particular policy area. Whereas if you have a statute that, gives complete discretion to the secretary, its discretion committed to it by law, well then there is no voice for civil servants. In other words, it would be fine if they were completely cut out of the process, because Congress does not see a role for this group of actors. And then finally, I want to say that civil servant disobedience is only legitimate when it adheres to professional norms. Okay, so for example, if a scientist's ground for disobeying is based on research that fails peer review or otherwise violates scientific norms, then I think it's also illegitimate. So the strongest objection, as I said, to civil servant disobedience is that civil servants, unlike private citizens, can and should resign. For doing so would allow accountable actors to maintain control. And this objection is a very strong one, okay? But I just want to consider some counterarguments. First, just consider that civil servants are required to take oaths, not to the president, but to the Constitution. So witnessing unconstitutional directives and then resigning, knowing that your replacement is going to carry out the unconstitutional directive, could be understood as a violation of one's own constitutional fidelity. Second, Congress has enacted a number of whistleblower statutes that suggest a legislative desire to protect disclosures rather than encourage withdrawals. These statutes explicitly prohibit adverse personnel actions for, quote, refusing to obey an order that would require the individual to violate a law. In other words, perhaps we could read these to suggest that Congress has sought to encourage rather than discourage disobedience despite the potential cost to agency management. And then finally, let me just observe, insofar as managerial control is certainly the strong interest on the other side, that resignations can be just as disorderly, if not more, than civil servant disobedience. So for example, expressive acts where somebody resigns and writes a very scathing public letter can depress agency morale, can be very disruptive to the agency. And then exits can also be resistant, leading to civil servants attacking the agency from the outside in ways that are often more effective and credible. So finally, to take a step back, how should we think about the more dynamic effects of civil servant disobedience? Even if we think that there might be democratic benefits, what are its long-run costs? So here I just want to make one final observation, that open dissent invites presidential backlash, right, as evidenced by Trump's numerous executive orders aimed at weakening the civil service, which of course preceded much of the disobedience, but I think is only gotten stronger in the face of it. Indeed, the deep state rhetoric has been persuasive to many. And this internecine conflict not only erodes the norms of professionalism that I think have historically defined the civil service, but it also weakens the presidency. Presidential policies in a post-Trump world may not be as informed nor as effectively executed without a loyal civil service. And so the real and pressing question going forward, therefore, may not be whether civil servant disobedience is justified, but rather how to restore mutual bureaucratic trust.
Okay, thank you. We'll turn now to our commenters alphabetically. So first is Sally Katz, currently professor of practice and distinguished scholar in residence at NYU Law School with a resume of distinguished public service that's far too long to read, time as administrator of OIRA and deputy director for management at OMB during the Clinton administration, among many, many others. So I'll turn it over to Sally.
Well, thank you very much, and I am delighted to be here. One gets ready for panels either by fretting about what you can add to the subject or by doing a lot of research. And I thought I would start with Jennifer's paper, and I thought it was really well done. It's an interesting subject, and she really does an excellent job of unpacking some of the considerations that are important. I was also struck by the humility that she had at the beginning of her paper, where she says that this is a first step, and I'll undoubtedly be rethinking and rewriting. I thought humility is nice, but as I kept reading, I was overwhelmed with my own humility as I saw the very impressive array of political science and legal authorities that she cited. So I do encourage you to actually look at this paper when it is available for publication. There was one issue that she addressed that gave me some unease, and that was the definition or the delineation of what constitutes civil service disobedience. She says it should be done in your official capacity, although some of the instances that she reports were people saying that they were doing it in their private capacity. Obviously, it has to be nonviolent. She talks about it being communicative, and she mentioned today that it needs to be overt. And I was interested in the fact that for covert attempts of resistance, she does not include them, although things like slow walking orders or secretly leaking information strike me as consequential in the exact same way. And I don't know that there's a valid distinction if you're looking at the consequences of what is being done in terms of undermining authority or frustrating the accomplishment of objectives. And this bit about it's to bring about some kind of reform. Really? What if the communication is intended simply to elucidate the record, that there was information that was not included or deliberately excluded that would make discussion of this public policy issue more thoughtful? And if so, how do we discern whether the person is trying to bring about a change or simply make clear that there are other considerations? So my mind was not quite as nimble as hers to make these fine distinctions. And I think I came away thinking it might be both over-inclusive and under-inclusive in her definition. It's not easy to get your hands around. On the other hand, I thought she had great handle and provides a useful frame for thinking about the reasons for the rash of recent civil service disobedience and what she referred to as her reciprocal hierarchy. And I wanted to repeat what she said that's in the paper. When the hierarchies not only facilitate top-down control, but also bottom-up information sharing. And when the ideal is under siege, there's space for legitimate civil service disobedience. In other words, when political appointees refuse to recognize the reciprocal nature of the hierarchy, and these are my words now, they get what they deserve. Now, she recounts several documented reports in the Trump administration where the reciprocal hierarchy was not honored by not consulting federal employees on important policy matters and cutting them out of the decision-making. Yep, that's what has been reported, and there are a lot more incidences that have not gone reported. But I wanted to spend my time saying that this is not a phenomenon unique to this administration. Political appointees of all incoming administrations are deeply suspicious, and they keep arm's length from civil servants who have served under their predecessors, especially when that predecessor is of a different political party. And I remember being at OMB in the early days of President Clinton, and the civil servants who were there then were not allowed to accompany us to meetings in the West Wing, even though they had the information or had done the analysis that was critical to the decision-making process. Now, it all changed when Leon Panetta, then the director of OMB, became the president's chief of staff, and he knew these civil servants. He knew that they were conscientious and they were dedicated and working faithfully for the office of the president, and therefore the incumbent president, and the doors opened wide. Goody. Then came George W. Bush, and they were once again excluded because they had worked for Clinton and presumably were not worthy to be trusted. That too changed ultimately, and then came the Obama administration. Now, I was helping to run the Obama-Biden transition and preached again and again to all the incoming political appointees the importance and the incalculable benefits that come from working with the career staff. We said, as Jennifer has mentioned, you don't have to take their opinion and make it your own. You don't have to agree with them, but listen to them. Hear what they have to say. They may have known of an attempt to do this before that failed and why it failed. You can learn a lot from them, and then you make the decision. Some followed our advice. Others didn't do so. And then came the Trump administration, which, as in so many other things, took the hostility to and distance from the civil service to a whole new level. Starting with the landing teams. I don't know if you remember the landing teams, who I've been told by members of career staffs in a number of different agencies came in, did not ask a single question, only said what they wanted to do and when, and they never got back to the career staff with any feedback, any reactions, any follow-up. And then came the political appointees, who surrounded themselves with their own people, other political appointees, their former associates, Schedule Cs, special assistants, who again rarely reached out to the career staff. Now, there are stories of people who were able to get to the political appointees, the first one in the door. There were lots of meetings that have been chronicled with senior administration officials, cabinet members or otherwise, taking meetings with maybe an aide, but no members of the career civil service. No pre-briefs had occurred ahead of time, or they were not in attendance, and it makes it very difficult then for anybody to carry out the judgment. And this is why we have seen, I believe, that the work product of the first year, and maybe more, is having a great deal of difficulty in the courts surviving judicial scrutiny, whether it be executive orders or regulations. So the civil servants were ignored or treated without respect. That is hardly conducive to the reciprocal hierarchy. To the contrary, it created a culture of disrespect and inaccessibility. And as she said today, when the internal channels break down, there's more normative space to appeal directly to external political challenges. But once you head into this field of negativity and disrespect about the civil service, you're following a well-trod path that cannot be laid solely at the feet of the Trump administration. For decades now, we have been hearing about our civil servants, and not in flattering terms. You can go back to Reagan, who famously said, "Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem." And think of the many barbs from sundry politicians amplified by sundry news outlets about those nameless, faceless bureaucrats often associated with waste, fraud, and abuse. It kind of trips off the tongue. Bureaucrat bashing is Washington's favorite spectator sport, with unintended or perhaps intended consequences. Faith in our government and those who do the government's work is long gone. It's not even clear that the public understands what our civil servants do. Indeed, the demise of civics in public schools means that many people do not understand what the government does or even think about the people who are doing that work. And I am dismayed by how little credence is given to a notion that was expressed at lunch by President George Herbert Walker Bush, that public service is a noble calling. Is that sell today? Would people that just come tripping off the tongue? Or that civil servants are working for the public good rather than to line their pockets? In my experience, the virtually universal scorn and derision of our civil servants is not justified and is a grave disservice to all of us. But this caricature of public employees is now seared into the public's consciousness. No wonder many civil servants can and do feel misunderstood, alienated, or at least unappreciated. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that even given this bleak landscape, Civil service resistance is always justified or is something that I would condone. But I'm saying there are many people and institutions, and that finger pointing at the civil servants, criticizing what they may be doing about where they find themselves, will not get us very far. As one famous playwright once said, "The fault, dear Brutus, lies not in our stars, but in ourselves."
Okay, thank you, Sally. We turn now to GMU's Scalia Law School's own Jeremy Rabkin, who I learned from his very brief submitted bio here, was associate editor of Regulation magazine under editor-in-chief Antonin Scalia in 1979 to 1980. And,
then it was downhill from there.
but his downhill has led you to this panel today. So let's hear from Jeremy.
I want to start by saying I thought the title of the paper is an irresistible pun, but I had to think about it for a minute to get that, right? Civil disobedience, civil servant disobedience, yes. The topic is intriguing. It made me really queasy. And I just, in my few minutes, want to explain why it made me really uncomfortable. So I think of this as the equivalent of emergency powers, or as Locke calls it, the prerogative. When there's an extreme challenge, the executive can act without law and even against it. And he goes on for several pages about this. When they came to talk about the executive in the Federalist Papers, they thought, all right, we don't need to go into that. That doesn't need to be said explicitly. It's not a good thing to talk about. Being relentlessly thorough and pedantic, the Constitution drafters for the Weimar Constitution thought, let's put that in there, emergency powers. There need to be emergency powers. What if there is an emergency? Oh, were they sorry for having put that in there? This is the kind of thing that everybody knows, which is you should always tell the truth. That's what you tell children. But if you're a grown-up, you realize, okay, if there's like a maniacal murderer knocking on your door and saying, I'm coming to get Jill, you say, she's not here, even if she is there, right? So sometimes you will not tell the truth, and it could be morally justified, but you don't explain that to children, and you don't go around talking about it because it's an exception. And I could belabor the point, but I think it's obvious our moral standards and our standards of professional duty have to be based on the generality. And yes, there could be somewhere in an extreme case an exception. Don't highlight that because people will abuse it. And in Jennifer's paper, she says, oh, I mean it only in this way, this way, in this way. And then when Sally was summarizing, she said, civil servant resistance. Okay, resistance is a much broader category than what Jennifer was talking about, but I don't think Sally was even aware that she was like opening the door to a much wider phenomena. But Jennifer is already opening the door to a much wider phenomena because she's saying, I only mean it in a nice way. People are not hearing the rest of that. I'm sorry. If you think about this, it seems to me that Sally is right, that if what you're talking about is like, oh, we have to challenge, then you might as well just do the whole thing. I'm going to come back to, no, you better not. But so civil disobedience, if this term was not invented by Henry David Thoreau, it was at least popularized by him, and I think he meant the civil point with particular emphasis, which is it is an appeal to the civic body. To say, I am willing to go to jail. That's how committed I am to my position. Do you have the nerve to put me in jail? Right? It was a kind of confrontation, and that is exactly how Martin Luther King took it. It's a public challenge to the authorities to say, do you really believe in your policy? Okay, so it has to be open. It's not necessary to belabor as you do in the paper. I'm not saying belabor is criticism, but you set it all out in the paper like, oh no, it does have to be public, it has to be legal, it has to be this, it has to be that. But that would go without saying if you really meant civil disobedience. But I think the phenomena that we are faced with now is this tiniest part of it, if any, is civil disobedience. And I was troubled in the paper that although you set out all these criteria, I don't think you give one example in this paper of something which is unambiguously that thing that you claim to be talking about, because I don't think it happens. And that is when someone says, I am a GS, whatever they are, 17. Is that too low?
Too high. 14.
I'm a GS 14, but I cannot obey this regulation, and I am going to publicly show and say to the public, come after me, I challenge you. You don't give one example of that. The examples that you mentioned here, I thought were clearly not that, which is people go outside the building and say, we're against the appointment of Scott Pruitt, and the building is in Chicago, and they have nothing to do with the appointment. So they're just saying, I don't like him. They're just expressing their opinion. That's not even disobedience. It's not anything. It's just typical showing off. The other example that you gave, the special agents saying immigration shouldn't proceed in this way. That's just oversharing. They were not disobeying, right? So I don't think this is a real phenomenon, the one that you purport to be talking about, the heroic civil servant who says, here I stand, I can do no other. That's not how they work. I mean, people are laughing here. Fine. So when you're GS-14, you're not heroic. By the way, if you were really heroic, you probably wouldn't be a civil servant. And I'm sorry, the reason why the country sneers at civil servants is they know it is impossible to fire them. And they think, oh, these are the kind of people who value job security above all. And so they have a really cushy life, which kind of they do. And I'm not saying that's terrible. I have a cushy life. I can't be fired, so I appreciate that. I do appreciate that. But these are not people inclined to heroic gestures. And if your project is to explain why the person who undertakes the heroic gesture should be admired or respected, then I wouldn't take civil servants as your models, because they're not kind of the people for that. We should remind ourselves civil service protection, originally in the 19th century when they started, it was to deprive parties of patronage. It wasn't to protect heroism. And we should remind ourselves that it is not actually normal, except in universities, another place where very unheroic people are cowering behind their job protection. Not at George Mason, my colleagues at George Mason are wonderful, but in the rest of the academy,
NYU is pretty good, too.
All right, great, so there's two. But for the rest of the academy, these are very cowardly people. It's just ludicrous. They have to be protected with tenure so they can all say the same thing about anything that is uncontroversy. So we should remind ourselves, in real life, people organizing a company, people organizing a nonprofit, people organizing any kind of activity where you need to get people together, of course it's good to get information from people who work for you. That's just like obvious basic management. But sometimes they tell you more than you want to hear, or sometimes they tell you things and you realize they're not really going to be good on the team, and so you get rid of them. And that is also part of management. This is a really strange situation in which you have these people who it's very difficult to fire. And so, of course, the public is kind of like, okay, they're not really working very hard. And sometimes they are not working at least effectively. You mentioned in the paper the Veterans Administration. Look, the Veterans Administration is failing to take care of people who, of all the people in the country, that are among the ones that have the best claim on our care and protection, right? And we've had a series of scandals in which people didn't get treatment at VA hospitals. And you say, well, the Trump administration is cracking down. Yes, it should crack down. By the way, it did it with authorization of Congress. So it's not even particularly a Trump policy. Management usually involves putting some pressure on your employees. We want you to go this way and not that way. And if you don't fit in, well, sorry, maybe you should go somewhere else. And your project starts with, no, wait, these people who already have job protection need to have some additional protection to be disobedient. And I'm thinking, really? Why? So let me just go a few steps further and say, the way you talk about it, it's the manager and the employee, or the manager and the staff, and there needs to be information going up and down. Well, that is kind of abstract. What the obvious thing that is missing is that the staff, I know they work hard sometimes, I know they're good people sometimes, I don't mean to say this in a sneering way, but I live in Washington, so I kind of know a lot of these people. They're overwhelmingly Democrats, and they're overwhelmingly liberal, and for sure, they overwhelmingly believe in the agencies that they work for and think the agencies that they work for should have more power. That's not a crime, that's not terrible, but if you say, there's a kind of conflict between the employees and the managers. I'm sorry, it's not just employees and managers, and that's not how much of the public sees it. It is rather a conflict now in a Republican administration between political superiors who want to limit government and employees who want to expand it. Right? It is about something that, come to think of it, we vote on in elections. And when you say, they need protection to engage in civil disobedience, what you're implicitly saying is they need to be able to, as Sally said, resist the people who are elected to limit government. And this is disturbing to me. Let me just end by saying, I want to say two things before I end. And the first is, if you step back and look at this in a slightly different context than the EPA, which for most people is eye-glazing, certainly for my eyes, I can't keep up with it. But let's look at it in a slightly different context. So we just had within the last week, people leaked from the CIA. We know that Prince Mohammed bin Salman knew about what happened in the consulate in Istanbul. What was that about? So clearly what that was about was to make the president look bad. It wasn't to change the policy, it was to make the president look bad. But in leaking that, I think it's pretty clear people somewhere in the intelligence world thought it was good to to actually accept the cost that we flag to Saudi Arabia. We know everything that your guy is saying because we're monitoring his phone calls. Maybe they didn't know that. Now they know it. Was it worth releasing that? Well, it was if you really hate Trump and you're in the resistance, okay? So being in the resistance means you can undermine the country, you can undermine national security, but is it worth it because you hurt Trump? It's not changing a policy, it's just a political campaign. What if, instead of the civil servants doing this, it was the political appointees? The law needs to be changed. You know, the president was extremely vulgar, and he shouldn't have said it, but that's who he is. But actually, come to think of it, there are judges who are, let's not call them Obama judges, but left-wing judges. And what if, as the chief executive, you think we need to have civil disobedience of judicial orders which are wrong? They're just wrong. We need to have civil disobedience. If anyone stood up and said that, or did 20 pages on this, we haven't met before, maybe you would say, that's intriguing, that's interesting, but I think probably many of your teachers at the Yale Law School would say he should be impeached for that. We're allowed to say that. A president is not allowed to say that the law is wrong and the Supreme Court is wrong. It's back to this point. Of course, there are things we all know which you shouldn't encourage people to take too seriously or to think of as a regular kind of thing. We had all of these people in the FBI somewhere who leaked all kinds of things about General Flynn, who was talking to the Russian ambassador. Where did that come from? Somebody thought it would be good for the public to know these kinds of things. In the process, what they did was highlight that, the Foreign Surveillance Intelligence Act, which requires that when we're doing surveillance, we mask the identity of Americans. We're just kidding about that. We can unmask them whenever we want. So the government is actually listening to all of us, and civil servants can play with that and leak it when they want to. I think that was extremely destructive. I think it really undermined confidence in some surveillance activities which are important for national security. They did it to hurt Trump. So it's dangerous to encourage civil servants to do these things. And if you go back to what was the original point of civil service protection, it It was to deny patronage to the parties. It was to reduce somewhat the intensity of party competition. It is now doing the opposite. If you encourage civil servants to act on their impulses, which is mostly we're Democrats, mostly we're liberals, mostly we're in favor of our agencies, mostly we hate elected Republican presidents, especially vulgar ones like Trump. If you encourage them to do that, you convey to the country that there is an ongoing conflict between, yes, the deep state and people who have been elected and are accountable to the voters and to the press and have to do everything in the open. And so you intensify party conflict, and I think the inevitable result of this is to undermine trust in government. And I was very moved by what Paul Verkaal said this morning. I do think it's really alarming the extent to which people regard the government as it's contemptible, or at best, or it's threatening, it's deceitful. Right? People have a very low opinion of government. This is dangerous to us. This is not going to be helped by encouraging civil servants to undermine the government and be partisan agents. And even if you say, oh, I didn't mean it in that way, it's going to be heard that way. It's going to be seen that way. So this is, I think, playing with poison. Here's my last metaphor. Some poisons in a small amount are actually helpful. Like we actually need iodine in our diet. I learned that from Judge Posner. Yes, good point. Yes. Don't tell it to children. And I wouldn't even have the FDA talking about that. Well, a little bit of poison would be fun. And I think what you're doing here is playing with poison, and even a little bit is not a good thing. Try to confine it to private email communications and just hope that the government, when it monitors your private email communications, will not unmask you to other people. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jeremy. We now turn to our last. Fair enough. Good Jeremiah from Jeremy. We turn now to Bill Valdez, who is the president of the Senior Executives Association. Can give us the perspective from that direction. He had more than a 20-year career in the Department of Energy, and we're behind time, so I'll turn to you.
Thank you, and I'm going to have a hard time following that, Jeremy, you know. But, so I am the representative of the deep state. I know the secret handshake. I do have a card that identifies me as a member of the deep state. Actually, I'm joking. There is no deep state. I can't imagine, you know, during my time in the federal government, where I came across not even small spread, let alone widespread resistance to the direction of political authority. And that's both coming from the Congress and from the president, whoever the president was. The administrative state is exactly that. It is an administrative state. And this notion that somehow there is this mass movement within the government to thwart the will of whichever president happens to be in office is simply nonsense. So let me tell you what senior executives are. So there are 2.1 million federal employees. The vast majority of them are GS 1s through 15s. There are 10,000 members of what is called the Senior Executive Service. That is the group that my association represents. I was a senior executive in the federal government. And you have to realize that that is a distinct role that is played by the senior executives in the federal government versus the general schedule employees. So by law, the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 created the Senior Executive Service to serve as the buffer between the GS world and the political world. It's written into statute. And the reason that Congress did that was a recognition that they needed a class of executives in the federal government, career executives, who were the buffer between the political world and the career world. And so there is a special role for them to play in this discussion we're having today. Now, with that great responsibility came some rules that made it easier to fire SES compared to general schedules. And by the way, it is easy to fire somebody in the general schedule. I did it, and if you want to do it, if you feel the need to do it, you can do it. Also, the vast majority of civil servants, in my experience, are competent. They do their job for the right reason. And this notion that they are incompetent or simply, trying to win a paycheck or, playing the string out, I think is oppositional to my experience. So if you're a senior executive in the federal government, you have three things that a general schedule doesn't have. First, you can be reassigned with 60 days notice to any position in the federal government. And if you refuse that reassignment, you're terminated, okay? Second, there are added Hatch Act limitations. For example, I couldn't have a sign in my front lawn from a political candidate. I could not hold a I could not be an election judge. You have to be completely nonpartisan, which reflects the fact that you are that buffer between the career and the political world. And then the third, you're not a union, right? So you don't have union protections that most general service employees do. All this means is that you can be fired much easier than the typical federal employee. So you have to be really careful. You have to make sure that if you're going to be disobedient or insubordinate, it better be for a really good reason. Now, does civil service disobedience exist? Jeremy says no. I say yes. And there was actually a good example of it in the press recently. Joel Clement, who was a chief scientist at the Department of Interior, got into a debate with the Trump administration over climate change. And he fought and then eventually decided he could no longer work for the administration, so he resigned. Now, he did file a whistleblower suit. He has, all the other things that were available to his toolbox, but he engaged in civil service disobedience. Now, one of the things my association does is we serve as a clearinghouse for senior executives who are in trouble. And at the start of this administration, I was getting about 5 to 10 calls per week from senior executives who wondered whether or not they had an obligation to follow a direction that they didn't believe was lawful or ethical. They didn't believe that, served the mission of their agency, or they were being asked to do something that they found ethically queasy, okay? So my response to those individuals was, if you have been given an order that is lawful or is aligned with administration policy, then you have to follow it. Or you can resign or ask for a reassignment. You don't really have an option. I mean, that is the law, okay? Now, that's what Joel Clement did at the Department of Interior. So it is okay, under some circumstances, to engage in civil service disobedience.
Could you just say what law he disobeyed? Or what obligation he disobeyed?
Well, you frame this as matters of conscience, okay? No, civil service disobedience is matters of conscience, okay? And he believed that the Trump administration's policies were not aligned with his beliefs on climate change, okay? And so that's a matter of conscience, in my view.
It's fine, and he left. But you haven't given an example even now of disobeying his legal duties.
Yes, he did. He disobeyed them because he refused to implement the Trump administration policies.
Well, and then he left.
Yeah,
We got reassigned first, it would
right.
obscure position.
And that's happened numerous times with this administration, with other administrations. I mean, it happens, okay? But it's never okay to disobey a lawful or non-criminal direction, okay? Now, I make a distinction here where I think that unethical is too squishy, and you need to really think about if you think this violates my ethical principles, whether or not I'm going to engage in civil disobedience. There are mechanisms to adjudicate this, and you mentioned them: whistleblower, IG, the Office of Special Counsel, the Merit Systems Protection Board are all there to help adjudicate these kinds of things. But I won't deny that you can slow walk, delay when you believe that political direction is perceived harmful to your agency's mission. Now think about that. I'm very careful in those words. When you perceive that it's harmful to your agency's mission, okay? So where does an agency get its mission from? It gets its mission from two sources. One is Congress, and one is from the administration, okay? Sometimes they come into conflict. And when they come into conflict, the career civil service often has to adjudicate that. Now, let me give you a couple of examples. The IRS, was given direction about how to interpret nonprofit political status. Okay, you remember that case? Lots of congressional hearings and all the rest. It was left to a career civil servant to interpret what the Congress meant by nonprofit political affiliation. And she got crosswise with that congressional interpretation. You remember the hearings that happened on that. It happens, okay? Second, the VA. You mentioned the VA. At the heart of the VA scandal, at least the one on long wait times, was the direction from an Obama political appointee to reduce wait times at hospitals. And they made that part of the performance plan of the senior executives, the people who ran the hospitals. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to try and decrease those wait times or have metrics that show that wait times, have been reduced. There was some falsification. But some of the medical directors decided not to follow that direction and to ignore it and do what they had to do, which was take care of the veterans. I would note, by the way, that VA hospitals have a higher customer satisfaction rating than public hospitals and private hospitals, by the way. And then finally, Jennifer, you mentioned that, people have to accept the sanctions that are imposed. That has a human cost. One of my senior executives was given direction that he could not follow, and then was given an administrative agency directed reassignment that he could not accept because he was not given the possibility to accept it. And so he had to resign. And it was a terribly tragic situation, but it was because of political influence on him that he believed, and I think was correct, was incorrect. And so there are consequences on a very personal level to engaging in civil service disobedience.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I've been remiss in my duties in cutting people off. Everyone had very interesting remarks. So I think what we're going to do is, Jennifer, if you could say the thing you're most dying to say
Yeah.
in response, and cut yourself off after that one thing, and then we'll turn to the audience.
Okay, so indeed, I'm also eager to get to the audience, especially on a topic like this, and the panel's given me a lot to think about, so I will just say one thing, which is to raise an issue for everybody in the panel and for discussion that I have been struggling with, which I think is clear in the paper and in my remarks here, about exactly what needs to be violated to constitute civil servant disobedience. Now, I expressly hive off and think very differently about judicial orders, so I think we're on the same page. I just want to limit my scope here to violations of executive orders, okay, not that haven't been judicially settled. And here, the struggle that I've been confronted with is how much to include violations of norms rather than executive norms, that is top-down norms, rather than explicit directions. So for example, I observe that it is an incredibly strong norm at agencies not to air disagreement outside of the agency. I think the norm is you raise the disagreement within the agency and you resolve it accordingly. And that norm is captured in a number of formalized documents. So for example, scientific integrity documents in the EPA, talk about the fact that scientific disagreement should be resolved internally rather than externally. And if we include norms in this project, then I submit that I think there is much more civil servant disobedience than if you cabinet more narrowly.
All right, well, I'm sure our panelists can argue all day if you give them the chance, but I'd like to give you all a chance to ask questions. So please wait for the microphone, I think, although I'm not sure. We might be waiting a long time. Sir, right, oh, okay.
Hi, this just is, I guess, on your defining civil disobedience. I mean, it seems to me like everyone agrees that more or less the only real civil disobedience is justified by from your management telling you to break the law in one way or another. But it seems like you can much more effectively combat that even without official civil disobedience by, for example, sending an email that very clearly tells whoever needs to know that you are breaking the law, and given FOIA and everything and emails that we have now, that you can make it so dangerous for the person breaking the law to continue breaking the law that would be as effective, but without going to the extreme of calling it disobedience.
Oh,
So-
absolutely. Well, that's why I think this needs to be a measure of last resort. That should be your first resort. Absolutely. Follow all the internal processes, use all the existing channels before you resort to this. I would hardly advocate for doing this as your first protocol.
So, yeah, just to follow up on that, though, there never will be any of those cases. I mean, precisely the cases that you're talking about as core cases of civil disobedience are cases where you have civil service protections and you can't be fired. I mean, because you're being asked to do something that's flagrantly illegal, and maybe it's not going to ever be teed up, but I just don't see. I see there's a perfect symmetry so that there's really not that real mushy middle. And I think so I guess I'm just not clear if what you're talking about is a normative or a descriptive kind of a thing. And the most interesting case to me really is the slow walking case. It's not so much violating the law, but it's something where someone comes in and they say, I'm a civil servant, I have neutrality and expertise, but I'm also human, and I really just can't, divorce my politics from all of this, and so some of these things are kind of going to get filed away. And I think that's really the core case of what we're talking about, and that would be most interesting to kind of hear about when that's legitimate. So I mean, this all goes back to the cabining issue.
I think you really have to distinguish about where the direction is coming from. Because as I said, direction comes from two different political sources. It comes from the Congress and it comes from the administration. And sometimes they disagree, and it's left up to the civil servant to interpret whether or not how that disagreement, plays out. I mean, I can think of lots of examples in my career where I was given direction to do something, and I knew that there were congressional statutes, authorizations, that prohibited me from doing that. And so you have to make those kinds of judgments and call it slow walking, call it, protecting the agency mission, but that does occur on a regular basis within the bureaucracy.
Could I just add one thing here? When I was at OIRA, I had some bright ideas which weren't very bright. And the last thing I wanted was an email thank you, although they were just coming into existence in the dark ages when I served. What I wanted and what I got were people coming to my office and saying, "You don't want to do this. This is a problem." And they would talk to me about why I shouldn't be doing something. And my response usually was to recognize my failures in how I had thought about it and go with the staff who knew more about it. What is that? It's called management. And it's a word we haven't really used very much in this discussion. But if you think about government officials and you think about the civil service, there's a management question. Do you engender their loyalty and their respect? And I disagree very much with Jeremy. I don't think they're just off on their own agenda. I think they work until 11:59 on January 20th for the incumbent, and on 12:01 on for the new incumbent. And they do the job that they're supposed to do. I might be iconoclastic because OIRA is special, and we all know it's special. But the people who I had the pleasure to work for were not there because of job security. I had come from a top-rate law firm, and the people who worked for me at OMB were harder working, more diligent, more dedicated to carrying out whatever crazy ideas I might have had than I ever had from the associates at Wilmer Cutler. These were hardworking people who were not there to just get a paycheck. Now, again, I may be unusual, and OIRA may be unusual, but I don't think so.
Other questions? So right here.
Kind of like an academic topic selection question that I was thinking about with this kind of endogeneity point. So we might have in mind there's a phenomenon in the world. We're an academic. We describe it. We understand it, and that happens. Or there's this kind of endogeneity argument. We point out the phenomenon. We talk about it, and maybe we affect how often that phenomenon occurs, how people perceive it. So I don't have answers, and it's just a question. When you're thinking about a paper like this, and there's a lot of misinformation in the world around civil servants, you could imagine a paper that's civil servant obedience, that says the story I want to tell is that civil servants obey and they listen, and guess what, new officials, you don't need to worry that they're going to leak everything. And that would affect the endogeneity side of it. That might affect the way people who read it perceive it differently. But it wouldn't help to understand a topic that was on everyone's minds, over the past couple of years. So I think I've articulated the challenge that I have in my mind, which is how do you resolve when there's a phenomenon you want to understand, but there is a risk that by understanding it or by talking about it, you might influence the phenomenon.
I mean, I'll let other academics speak for themselves. I'll just speak for myself and say, I think for myself, I don't care about the consequences. Meaning, by which I think as academics we have this norm that we just want to understand something. And I mean, I'm overstating to say I don't care, but I want to be driven by the question and the description and the exploration, the humility with which to approach a problem rather than to affect some outcome. But, look, we academics fail at that often, but that is the norm, I think, that I aspire to, and I'm sure many academics do as well. Let me just use this opportunity briefly about topic selection here to just address this lingering issue of overt versus covert resistance, because I want to acknowledge and take on board that it could very well be the case that covert resistance is much more common, and that I have just sort of identified this less common form of resistance, both because I do perceive it, the extent of it, to be a little bit more novel to the administration, the overt resistance, and so I just want to observe that. I can't prove that empirically, but I have the impression that that is happening more. So I just want to sort of observe that. And then as a normative matter, I think there's a huge difference whether resistance is overt versus covert, and they require different normative analyses. I mean, my instinct is to say, I think covert resistance is much more dangerous than overt resistance, because at least overt resistance, again, subjects civil servants to sanctions, and it can also actually improve a political discourse.
I thought that was a very challenging question, so thank you. We shouldn't exaggerate the effect that academic writing has on the outside world.
There's that too.
But I do think that academics should feel some sense of responsibility for what they do. So we're all being so nice here, and we all are so nice here. Let me make this a little less nice. There is this phenomena in the military, fragging. Sometimes soldiers shoot their officer. They kill their officer because he's trouble. And I don't know how often this happens. I hope very, very rarely. And maybe I have a very exaggerated idea because I've seen it in movies or read it in novels and stuff. But you could see someone could write an article explaining that, of course, you shouldn't do this, except in the following circumstances. When the officer is clearly a threat to the lives of the men under his command because he is making clearly wrong decision. You could go down a list of things, and then you could show that, in certain circumstances, which maybe are unusual, and maybe it's much more usual that you should obey, but still there could be some circumstances in which, it could be morally justifiable to shoot your officer. I would be inclined to think, this is not my career, I would absolutely defer to somebody at West Point, but I would be inclined to think that's not helpful. And if you're an academic, you should not pursue that. Probably it'll be ignored, don't worry, although now in the age of the internet, someone will it's just this is not a discussion that should be encouraged. And I think that is a reasonable concern, right? I'm not saying at all, Jennifer's doing that. But I think academics should have some sense of conscience about, is this a perspective which would be helpful? And I have to say, usually the academic world is the opposite. There are all kinds of topics which are simply off limits. You cannot now discuss men and women, are they different? Maybe, a little bit, somewhat. If you get started on that, you will be destroyed, so everyone knows, no, they're not, I have no data. Well, I do, but I cannot publish that. That cannot be discussed. Okay? I think that's a little bit overreacting, because I think men and women are still kind of going to be interested in each other no matter what, but there we have it.
All right, Jeremy. We get it. We need to destroy the videos of this panel before they go public. One last question.
Jim Tozier, I want to make one comment on the people who said that academics don't have an impact. Almost 50 years to this date, I was in the Pentagon, and at that time we brought in professors from academia and let them work for 1 year. And we had an institutional economist come in, and I was in a group of operations research analysts. And this institutional economist came in, and he looked, and he had 1 month to look at the whole thing that we worked on and came up with a project he wanted to do. And that guy's name was Alan Schmidt. And he came up with the idea, and he said, benefit cost analysis is applied to weapon systems, it's applied to Corps of Engineers projects. I think benefit cost analysis should be applied to regulations. 50 years ago, no one ever thought of applying benefit cost analysis to regulations. In fact, there were very few regulations because it was all economic regulation. That professor planted that issue, and that's where we are now. So never underestimate the power of a powerful academic because they can have a big impact.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. So join me in thanking the panel.